Welcome to the channel. Here we dive deep into powerful books and break down their ideas in a calm, thoughtful way. In today's episode, we explore Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, a compelling look into what truly drives success, from hidden advantages and timing to culture, opportunity, and practice. If you enjoy clear, thought-provoking breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for more.
So if you want your child to grow up to be, say, a professional, elite-level hockey player,
Right.
you might think the secret is buying them the best skates or hiring a private coach.
Yeah, or instilling some sort of, aggressive winning mindset from day one.
Exactly. But mathematically speaking, the single most effective thing you could do is just make sure they're born in January.
Right. Which sounds completely absurd when you put it like that.
It really does. Not February, not March, just January.
I mean, we are so heavily conditioned to believe that worldly success is just this direct, uncomplicated result of raw individual merit.
Oh, absolutely.
We look at a prodigy or a billionaire or a star athlete, and we just assume, well, we are looking at a fundamentally superior human being.
We really do expect this clean, linear equation. It's like we want to take an X-ray of a successful person's soul, right?
Yeah.
And find that glowing, jagged core of pure, unadulterated grit.
Yeah.
And we point to it and say, there it is. That's why they won. They just wanted it more.
Which is such a comforting narrative, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the classic Horatio Alger, rags to riches, pull yourself up by your bootstraps story.
Because it makes us feel in control. We think if we just isolate their habits, maybe copy their morning routine or read the books they read, we'll find the secret sauce. Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today in this deep dive is to completely deconstruct that myth.
And it is a myth.
Total myth. We are going to explore what we might call the invisible ecology of success. And we're drawing on the groundbreaking insights from Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers.
I love that phrase, by the way, the ecology of success. Because to truly understand why someone reaches the absolute pinnacle of their field, we have to stop staring so intently at the individual.
Right, we have to widen the lens.
Exactly. We have to look around them. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's very much like biology. Think of the tallest oak tree in the forest.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Our instinct is to look up at that massive canopy and think, wow, that must have been a genetically superior acorn. What a heroic tree.
Right, it just tried harder than the other trees.
Exactly. But a biologist doesn't look at it that way at all. The biologist knows that the tallest oak is only the tallest because of a really complex, invisible history of advantages.
Like, no other trees happened to be blocking its sunlight when it was just a tiny sapling.
Yes. And the soil in that exact specific spot happened to be unusually deep and rich.
No lumberjack came through and cut it down.
Right. And no rabbits chewed its bark when it was vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
It survived and thrived because of its environment, not just its DNA.
So true.
And to prove that our highly individualistic sort of X-ray lens is fundamentally broken, we actually need to step away from the billionaires and tech geniuses for a moment.
Okay, where are we going?
We need to look at a medical mystery that completely baffled the scientific establishment back in the 1950s.
Oh, the story of Roseto.
Yes, Roseto?
This is such a wild, counterintuitive place to start a conversation about success. But it makes perfect sense once you see the mechanism. So, let's travel to Roseto, Pennsylvania. It's this tiny, tightly knit town of Italian immigrants, mostly from the exact same village in Italy called Roseto Valfratore.
Right. They essentially picked up their village and just dropped it into the foothills of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, exactly. And in the 1950s, a physician named Stuart Wolfe and a sociologist named John Brenn stumble upon what is basically a statistical impossibility.
Or keep in mind the historical context here. The 1950s in America was the era of the heart attack.
It was a massive epidemic.
Rampant. We didn't have cholesterol-lowering drugs. We didn't have widespread preventative cardiac care. And men were just dropping dead of heart attacks in their 40s and 50s at alarming rates. It was the leading cause of death.
But not in Roseto.
Yeah.
In Roseto, virtually no one under the age of 55 had heart disease. Heart attacks were practically non-existent.
Which is mind-blowing.
And for men over 65, the death rate from heart disease was half that of the rest of the United States. Half. I mean, they were essentially just dying of old age.
Which was absolutely unheard of.
Yeah.
So Wolfe and Brenn do what any rigorous scientist would do. They start looking for the cause.
Because there has to be a reason.
Right. They assume there has to be a biological or behavioral explanation, so they synthesize the data to rule out the usual suspects. First on the list, naturally, is diet.
Because it's Italians, right.
Exactly. They assume these Italian immigrants must be eating some incredibly lean, healthy Mediterranean diet.
But they weren't. That's the crazy part. They were cooking with lard instead of olive oil.
Lord.
Yeah. They were eating incredibly heavy sugary sweets all year round, not just on holidays. They were eating pizza, but not the thin crust light tomato sauce kind. This was thick bread loaded with sausage, pepperoni, and cheese.
It was heavy stuff.
Something like 41% of their total caloric intake came straight from fat.
So diet is completely ruled out as a protective factor. Next, the researchers look at exercise and lifestyle habits. Like, were the Rositans engaging in vigorous cardiovascular routines? Were they jogging?
Far from it. The researchers found that the Rositans smoked heavily.
Oh, wow.
And a significant portion of the population struggled with obesity. I mean, they were working hard, sure, but they weren't doing morning yoga or hitting the gym. So exercise is totally out.
The next logical assumption in the medical playbook is genetics. Perhaps these specific families from this specific village in Italy carried some sort of, super gene that protected their arteries from plaque buildup.
Which sounds plausible.
It does. To test this, Wolf and Bruin meticulously tracked down relatives of the Rositans who had immigrated to other parts of the United States, places far away from Pennsylvania.
And the supergen theory collapsed too. Those relatives living in New York or Chicago had the exact same high rates of heart disease as everyone else in America.
They were dropping dead of heart attacks, just like the rest of the country.
So genetics is out.
Finally, they looked at the physical geography. Did the foothills of eastern Pennsylvania have some magical mineral property in the drinking water?
Or the altitude.
Right, but that didn't hold up either. The neighboring towns of Bangor and Nazareth, which were populated by different immigrant groups, mostly English and German, they shared the exact same water supply and the exact same climate.
Yet their heart disease rates were 3 times higher than Rosetto's.
Exactly.
Okay, so if it's not the lard-heavy diet, it's not the heavy smoking and lack of exercise, it's not a genetic mutation, and it's not the local water supply, what on earth is protecting these people's hearts?
The answer was Rosetto itself.
The town.
Yes, the invisible social structure of the town. When Wolf and Bruin stopped looking at the individuals and started walking the streets to observe the community, they saw something entirely unique in mid-century America.
What did they see?
They saw a deeply, profoundly interconnected society. They saw people constantly stopping to chat in Italian on the street. They saw multi-generational cooking happening in backyards.
Yeah, they had 3-generation households where grandparents lived with the kids and grandkids, right? And those elders commanded immense respect. They weren't isolated in retirement homes. They were the central pillars of family life.
And the civic engagement was staggering. I mean, for a town of fewer than 2,000 people, they had 22 separate civic organizations.
22.
Social clubs, church groups, community societies. At the center of all this was the unifying, calming effect of Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church, which really anchored the community's spiritual and social life.
Wow.
Furthermore, they had established this egalitarian ethos. It was culturally frowned upon for the wealthy to flaunt their success, and there was a tremendous unspoken safety net to support anyone who was struggling financially.
Okay, let me push back on this a little bit, or at least run a thought experiment with you, because this still feels almost magical.
Sure.
Are you seriously telling me that if you took a completely healthy rose-tan man, pull him out of that town, and dropped him into, say, a wealthy, modern, isolated suburb, you give him a Fitbit, a personal chef to cook him lean fish, a treadmill in his basement, but he doesn't know his neighbors, and he lives far away from his aging parents, his health would actually decline.
According to the profound implications of Wolf's findings, yes, it likely would.
That is wild.
Because what Wolf and Brood discovered is that physical health is not just a math equation of calories in, calories out, and genetic predispositions. It is a direct byproduct of your communal environment.
Huh.
The Rositans were insulated from the toxic chronic stress of modern isolation. When you have a deep sense of belonging, when you know that if you lose your job, your neighbors will bring you food, your baseline level of cortisol, the stress hormone that wreaks havoc on blood vessels, remains incredibly low.
And what's fascinating to me is how the medical establishment reacted to this. Because when Wolf and Bruin presented these findings to their peers at medical conferences, they were practically laughed out of the room.
Oh, they were. Completely dismissed.
Because doctors were trained to look at the individual. They wanted complex blood charts, genetic markers, individual behavioral choices.
Right. They had absolutely no scientific framework for the idea that pausing on a sidewalk to gossip with your neighbor in your native language could physically protect your heart from disease.
It totally mirrors our modern obsession with individual health metrics. We think if we just hack our own bodies enough, if we track every step, optimize our sleep scores, take the right supplements, we'll live forever.
But we're completely ignoring the ecology.
Exactly. We're staring at the acorn and ignoring the forest. If we don't have community, our biology actually turns against us.
Precisely. And this raises a crucial framing question for our entire discussion today. If community and environment can so profoundly dictate something as fundamentally physically biological as heart disease, how much more must those hidden social structures dictate worldly success?
Yeah, if your neighborhood can save your heart, what invisible forces are shaping your career, your intelligence, and your achievements? Which brings us perfectly back to the ice rink. Because if we want to examine how hidden, arbitrary structures dictate success, there is no better example than the strange world of Canadian junior hockey.
The Medicine Hat Tigers.
Yes, we're looking specifically at a deep dive into the 2007 Medicine Hat Tigers. This is a team in the Canadian Hockey League, which is the absolute top tier for junior players. These are the kids destined for the NHL.
Right.
And if you pull up their roster and just look at their birth dates, a bizarre, almost impossible pattern emerges. Almost all of these elite players were born in January, February, March, or April.
It's an astonishing statistical anomaly. You have a roster of roughly 25 players, and maybe one or two are born between September and December.
It's crazy.
The vast majority are clustered in the very first quarter of the year. And the explanation for this has absolutely nothing to do with astrology or the magical character-building properties of being a winter baby.
Right.
It comes down to a single, entirely arbitrary administrative rule. The age cutoff date for registering for Canadian minor hockey is January 1st.
Okay, I understand the rule, but break down the mechanics of why that matters so much. Because to me, a few months of age difference between kids doesn't seem like it should dictate an entire professional career.
Well, it doesn't seem like a big deal to an adult, right? Because the difference between a 30-year-old and a 30-year and 11-month-old is physically meaningless.
Yeah, completely.
But you have to wind the clock back to when these kids first lace up their skates. Imagine two kids trying out for a novice hockey league at age 9. One is born on January 2nd, right after the cutoff. The other is born on December 31st, right before the next cutoff.
So they are placed in the exact same age bracket.
Exactly. They are competing against each other.
But the child born on January 2nd is almost 12 full months older than the December kid.
Right. And at 9 or 10 years of age, a 12-month developmental gap is an eternity.
Oh, for sure.
The older child has had a year more of physical growth, a year more of neurological development, a year more of coordination. They're simply bigger, faster, and more mature.
Let me throw an analogy at this, because it's like judging a baking contest, but secretly giving half the contestants a 30-minute head start.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right. When the time is up, you taste all the cakes, and you point to the ones that had more time in the oven and say, wow, these bakers have an innate natural gift for pastry. You're mistaking a structural advantage for pure talent.
That is the perfect analogy, because the coach is standing on the ice looking at a group of 9-year-olds. He sees the January kid skating faster and hitting harder than the December kid. The coach doesn't look at their birth certificates. He just assumes the January kid is innately more talented.
Naturally.
And because of that mistaken assumption, the January kid is selected for the rep squad or the traveling all-star team.
And that's where the snowball really starts rolling. Because once you get placed on that elite team, your environment changes completely.
This is the critical mechanism. Once you are on the elite team, you get vastly superior coaching. Your team plays twice as many games in a season.
Yeah.
You practice 3 or 4 times a week instead of once or twice. You are consistently practicing against higher level competition, which forces you to elevate your game.
And there's a sociological term for this phenomenon, right? The Matthew effect.
Yes, coined by the brilliant sociologist Robert Merton. He named it after a verse in the biblical Gospel of Matthew, which basically reads, "For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath."
The rich get richer, basically.
In sociology, this is the concept of a cumulative advantage.
So the child who gets that tiny microscopic initial advantage, which is literally just the dumb luck of being born in the right month, is handed a special opportunity.
Exactly. And that opportunity fundamentally changes their environment, which multiplies their advantage over time. By the time these kids are 13, 14, or 17 playing for the Medicine Hat Tigers, the January kids actually are objectively better hockey players,
Just because of all that extra practice.
right? They have superior skills.
Yeah.
But that superiority didn't start with innate genius. It started with a calendar.
And the research shows this isn't just an isolated quirk of Canadian ice hockey. The economists Kelly Bedard and Elizabeth Dewey looked at education, specifically the TIMIS data.
Well, this study is fascinating.
Right. That stands for the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study. They analyzed test scores from around the world, and they found the exact same Matthew effect operating in our elementary schools.
Yes.
Fourth graders who were born right after the school cutoff date, meaning they were the oldest in their class, scored 4 to 12 percentile points higher than the youngest kids in the class.
And that tiny percentile difference at age 9 has massive compounding effects.
Right, because that's the age we start tracking kids. We look at those slightly higher test scores and we
Yeah.
say, oh, little Johnny is gifted, so we put him in the accelerated reading group or the advanced math track.
And what happens then?
He gets better teachers, more stimulating work, and a profound psychological boost to his confidence. Meanwhile, the youngest kid in the class, who is just as smart but biologically 11 months behind, gets put in the standard or remedial track and internalizes the identity of not being smart.
It's tragic, honestly.
So, what does this all mean? When you look at the macro level, are we literally throwing away half of the potential Czech soccer talent, or half the Canadian hockey talent, or half of the next generation of scientists just because we refuse to acknowledge a calendar?
Yes, we are. We are squandering human potential on a scale that is almost difficult to comprehend. We hold up these systems, elite sports leagues, gifted and talented academic programs, as perfect meritocracies.
Right, we think they're flawless.
We believe they are highly efficient machines designed to sift through the population and elevate the best and the brightest. But the data reveals they aren't true meritocracies at all. They are heavily, blindly filtering for relative age.
Which is such a solvable problem.
It is entirely solvable. If a society genuinely wanted to double its pool of elite athletes or world-class scholars, it wouldn't require genetic engineering. You could simply divide youth leagues or elementary school classrooms into distinct birth month cohorts.
It makes so much sense.
Let the kids born from January to April compete and learn only against each other. Let the September to December kids have their own league and their own gifted programs.
You would instantly level the developmental playing field and stop prematurely discarding late-born children.
Exactly.
Well, we don't do that. And I think we don't do it because it deeply threatens our cultural narrative.
How so?
We want to believe the tall oak tree grew from a magical acorn. We want to believe in the self-made hero. Acknowledging that our heroes are largely the product of administrative cutoff dates makes us uncomfortable.
It really does.
But the truth is, once a kid gets that lucky initial advantage of being born in January, what they actually receive is something much more tangible and much more valuable. They get the opportunity to practice.
Which leads us right into one of the most culturally pervasive, heavily debated concepts we're covering today. The 10,000-hour rule.
Oh man, this is a big one.
This is where we truly begin to deconstruct the illusion of innate talent. In the early 1990s, the psychologist K. Anders Ericsson conducted a fascinating, exhaustive study at Berlin's Elite Academy of Music. This is a conservatory that produces some of the finest classical musicians in the world.
Okay.
Ericsson and his team divided the school's violinists into 3 distinct groups. First, the stars, the students with the potential to become world-class soloists.
The best of the best.
Right. Second, the good players, those who would likely play in respected symphony orchestras. And third, the students who are highly unlikely to play professionally and were basically training to become public school music teachers.
So they asked all of them the same question, right? Over the course of your entire life, since the moment you first picked up a violin, how many hours have you practiced?
Exactly. And the results were revolutionary.
Yeah.
Because they found absolutely no naturals.
Let me stop you there, because that's a huge claim. You're saying in this elite academy, there was nobody in the star group who floated to the top by just picking up the violin, barely practicing, and playing flawlessly through sheer genetic gift.
Not a single one.
Wow.
Every single person in the elite group had practiced rigorously.
Yeah.
But equally importantly, they found no grinds.
Wait, what do you mean by grinds?
Meaning there was nobody who logged an astronomical amount of practice hours but remained stuck in the bottom group training to be a music teacher simply because they lacked some mysterious, unteachable X factor of talent.
Oh, I see. So what was the dividing line?
The defining factor, the only metric that consistently separated the elite soloists from the future music teachers, was the sheer volume of deliberate practice.
Practice time.
Yeah. By the time they were 20 years old, the elite performers had all accumulated roughly 10,000 hours of practice.
10,000 hours.
The good students had accumulated around 8,000 hours, and the future music teachers had logged roughly 4,000 hours.
That is wild.
Erickson's research, supported by neurologists like Daniel Levitin, suggests that 10,000 hours is the magic number of true expertise. It seems to take the human brain that specific volume of intense, focused repetition and correction to assimilate all the complex patterns it needs to know to achieve world-class mastery in cognitively demanding fields.
Okay, I have to push back here.
Go for it.
Because I have a really hard time letting go of the Mozart myth. I hear 10,000 hours, and I instantly think about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. The guy was famously composing symphonies when he was, 6 years old?
Right.
You cannot look me in the eye and tell me a 6-year-old child had managed to log 10,000 hours of deliberate, grueling practice. Talent has to be real.
Right. It's a completely fair challenge, and it's one that researchers have scrutinized closely. Mozart is the ultimate avatar of the innate genius myth. But when music critics like Harold Schoenberg and psychologists like Michael Howe actually analyze Mozart's early history, a very different picture emerges.
Really?
Yes. He was a prodigy, sure, but his early works weren't actually original masterpieces.
Wait, really?
No. His earliest compositions were mostly just arrangements of other composers' work. He was essentially doing highly advanced musical exercise.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Furthermore, his father, Leopold, was a famously overbearing world-class music instructor who forced Mozart to practice obsessively from the moment he could sit up. The first piece of music that critics widely consider to be a true original masterwork by Mozart is the Piano Concerto No. 9.
And how old was he when he wrote that?
He was 21 years old.
21.
He had been composing and practicing relentlessly for over 10 years by that point. He had put in his 10,000 hours. The genius didn't magically appear out of the ether. It was forged over a decade of obsessive labor.
Wow. That completely changes how you view him. And let's put 10,000 hours into perspective for anyone listening right now, because it's easy to just hear a large number and nod.
Right, it's a huge number.
10,000 hours is roughly 20 hours of deliberate practice a week, every single week, for 10 straight years. It is a full-time, part-time job that you cannot take a vacation from. It is an astronomical, almost punishing amount of time.
It is.
And the implication of that is huge, because you simply cannot hit 10,000 hours as a child or a teenager all by yourself.
No, you can't. That is the crucial hidden trapdoor of the 10,000-hour rule. To achieve that level of practice before your brain fully matures, you absolutely require a massive, unwavering support system.
You need parents.
You need parents who are willing to encourage, transport, and finance your obsessive practice. You cannot be impoverished, because if you have to work a minimum wage job after school to help your family pay the rent, you instantly lose the crucial hours you need to practice.
Right.
And perhaps most importantly, you need extraordinary, historically rare opportunities.
Which brings us to the ultimate modern examples of success, the software billionaires of the 1970s and 80s. Let's look at Bill Joy.
Great example.
He's the programming legend who essentially rewrote UNIX and helped found Sun Microsystems. He is often called the Edison of the internet. The myth is that he was just a lone genius, but the reality is a story of incredible, absurd luck.
Totally.
In 1971, Joy happened to enroll at the University of Michigan. Now, in 1971, computers were the size of rooms. To program them, you used punch cards. You'd spend hours punching holes in cardboard, hand a stack to an operator, wait a whole day, and then find out your program failed because you missed a single comma.
It was a wildly inefficient, frustrating way to learn.
Yeah.
You could never get enough rapid feedback to achieve mastery quickly.
Right. But the University of Michigan was one of the very first places in the entire world to transition from punch cards to time sharing.
Which changed everything.
They had a state-of-the-art computer center where you could type directly into a terminal and get a response instantly. This is the difference between sending a letter by horse and sending a text message.
Yeah, light years ahead.
And even better, Joy stumbled into a bug in the university's accounting software. He realized he could type in a specific command, I think it was TK, and the system wouldn't charge him for his computer time.
Unbelievable.
He had unlimited free access to one of the most advanced computers on the planet. He programmed day and night, logging thousands upon thousands of hours while the rest of the world was still dropping stacks of cardboard.
And we see the exact same phenomenon of extreme ecological luck with Bill Gates. Gates didn't just wake up in his 20s and decide to write the software that would define the personal computer revolution.
No, he had a massive head start.
In 1968, when he was in 8th grade, almost no high schools in the world had computers. Universities barely had them. But the Mothers Club at Gates's elite private school, Lakeside, held a rummage sale and used the proceeds to buy a time-sharing computer terminal hooked up to a mainframe in downtown Seattle.
Think about that. An 8th grader in 1968 had real-time access to a computer.
It's unfathomable. From that initial stroke of luck, Gates leveraged his location and privilege into a series of other wildly improbable opportunities. He found out a company called ISI needed someone to test their software in exchange for free programming time.
And then TRW.
Yes. Then he got a gig working for a tech company called TRW, where he spent his senior year of high school writing code instead of going to class.
Right.
By the time Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard to start Microsoft, he wasn't just a smart kid with a good idea. He'd been programming practically non-stop for 7 consecutive years.
He was a seasoned veteran.
We had well over 10,000 hours of experience.
And it's not just tech either. Look at the Beatles.
Ah, yes.
They didn't just walk out of Liverpool, strum a few chords, and instantly become the greatest band in history because they possessed magical English charm. In 1960, when they were still an unknown high school rock band, they got invited to play in Hamburg, Germany. And the club owners in Hamburg didn't want a standard 45-minute set. They demanded nonstop entertainment to keep people drinking. They forced the Beatles to play 8 hours a night, 7 days a week.
Which is physically and creatively grueling.
It's insane. To survive an 8-hour set, they couldn't just play their 10 best songs. They had to learn every song they could find. Jazz, blues, rock and roll covers. They had to learn how to captivate an unruly, drunken audience.
And it paid off.
By the time they had their first massive burst of international success in 1964, it's estimated they had performed live 1,200 times. Most successful bands today don't perform 1,200 times in their entire careers.
What's fascinating here is that we're absolutely not denying the innate talent of people like Bill Gates, Bill Joy, or the Beatles. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were profoundly gifted songwriters. Bill Joy was undeniably a mathematical genius. But what distinguishes their place in history isn't just their talent. It's their extraordinarily rare opportunities. Without the University of Michigan's Computer Center, without the Lakeside Mothers Club, without the grueling marathon gigs in Hamburg, none of them would have logged their 10,000 hours before their window of opportunity opened.
It really haunts you when you think about it. How many brilliant potential software pioneers were born in the exact same year as Bill Gates, with the exact same innate cognitive ability, but they lived in a rural town without a multi-thousand-dollar computer terminal?
Probably thousands.
How many musical geniuses are out there who just had to take a shift at the grocery store to pay rent instead of playing 8 hours a night in a German nightclub?
And this raises perhaps the most important question of our analysis.
Which is?
What happens when someone actually possesses the ultimate raw intellectual horsepower, the highest possible innate cognitive ability measured by science, but is completely deprived of the supportive environment needed to harness it?
Yeah, we have to talk about Chris Langan. This is a story that honestly breaks my heart a little bit because it illustrates the tragedy of uncultivated potential.
It really does.
To explain this, we need to contrast Chris Langan with a name everyone knows. Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist who directed the Manhattan Project and built the atomic bomb. Now, Chris Langan is a man with an IQ of 195.
And to put that in perspective, an average IQ is 100. Albert Einstein's IQ is estimated to have been around 150. Chris Langan's intellect is roughly 30% higher than Einstein's. He is a literal statistical super genius.
His brain is a supercomputer. I mean, he taught himself to read at age 3. By the time he was 16, he was casually reading Bertrand Russell's incredibly dense Principia Mathematica.
Just casually reading it.
He could ace foreign language tests by skimming the textbook for a few minutes before the bell rang. But despite this staggering intellect, Chris Langan did not cure cancer. He didn't win a Nobel Prize.
No.
He spent his adult life working mostly as a bouncer in a bar on Long Island and doing heavy labor on a horse farm.
To understand why a mind like Langan's didn't change the trajectory of human history, We have to examine the history of intelligence testing itself, specifically the work of a Stanford psychologist named Lewis Terman.
Okay, lay it out for us.
In the 1920s, Terman embarked on one of the most ambitious psychological studies ever attempted. He dispatched a small army of scouts into California schools to administer IQ tests to hundreds of thousands of students.
Wow.
From that massive pool, he selected 1,470 children with incredibly high IQs between 140 and 200. They became affectionately known as the termites.
And Terman was obsessed with these kids.
Completely obsessed. He tested them constantly, measured their physical health, tracked their reading habits. He firmly believed these termites were destined to rule the world. He thought a high IQ was the ultimate predictor of success, and that this group would produce the great scientists, artists, and political leaders of the 20th century.
But they didn't.
No, they didn't. As Terman tracked his termites over the next several decades, his grand hypothesis slowly unraveled. While many of them did okay becoming doctors or lawyers, a significant portion of them had distinctly ordinary, even disappointing careers.
Yeah, didn't he have a bottom group?
Yes, he categorized a whole group of them as Group C, the least successful, many of whom were struggling bookkeepers, postal workers, or chronically unemployed.
And here's the ultimate kicker. There were 0 Nobel Prize winners in Terman's exhaustively curated group of certified geniuses. None.
It's incredible.
In fact, his team had actually tested 2 elementary school students who did go on to win Nobel Prizes in physics, William Shockley and Luis Alvarez, and Terman rejected them both from his study because their IQs weren't quite high enough to make the cut.
Which brings us to a vital psychological concept known as the IQ threshold. What Terman's failure proved is that intelligence operates on a threshold.
Okay, what does that mean?
Once your IQ hits roughly 123, which is generally smart enough to graduate from a rigorous university, additional points of IQ do not systematically translate into greater real-world success. Having an IQ of 170 doesn't make you a better, more effective scientist than someone with an IQ of 130.
I always think of it like basketball height.
And that's a good one.
If you want to play in the NBA, being 5'6" is a huge disadvantage. You probably need to be at least 6'2" or 6'3". But once you hit, say, 6'6", every additional inch doesn't automatically make you a better player.
Right.
A player who is 6'8" isn't automatically better than Michael Jordan, who is 6'6". You just have to be tall enough to get on the court. After that, other skills matter way more. Speed, court vision, work ethic.
That is an excellent analogy. Analytical intelligence, which is exclusively what an IQ test measures, is what psychologists call a convergence test. It asks you to sort through a set of predefined possibilities and converge on the single correct answer.
Like solving a logic puzzle.
Exactly. It measures your ability to solve a logic puzzle.
Yeah.
But real-world success, whether in theoretical physics or running a business, rarely involves finding a single correct answer to a predefined puzzle.
Right.
It requires divergent thinking. It requires creativity, imagination, and the ability to generate multiple solutions to ambiguous problems.
And you can actually test for divergent thinking. There's a classic divergence test that just asks a simple question. How many uses can you think of for a brick and a blanket?
Exactly. When you give this test to someone with an astronomically high IQ but low divergent thinking, let's call her Florence, she gives very literal, boring, convergent answers. She might say, a brick is for building things, a blanket is for keeping warm.
Right.
But when you give the same test to a student named Poole, who has a lower, more average IQ but high creative divergence, his mind just explodes with possibilities.
He says, you could use the blanket to make a hammock. You could use the brick to break a window. You could tie the brick to the blanket and use it as a weapon or an anchor. Poole's mind leaps around creatively. Florence's mind moves in a straight, rigid line.
And this fundamental difference brings us directly back to Chris Langan and Robert Oppenheimer. Langan had the highest IQ imaginable, but his ecology, his environment, was disaster. He grew up in extreme poverty with an abusive stepfather and a deeply dysfunctional, chaotic family life.
It was so tough.
He never learned how to interact with the world to get what he wanted.
When Langan finally got a scholarship to college at Reed and later attended Montana State, he ran into bureaucratic walls that he simply didn't know how to climb. He lost a crucial scholarship, not because he failed a class, but because his mother didn't fill out a financial aid form correctly.
Which is devastating.
Later, when his car broke down, he asked a professor to temporarily move his calculus class from the morning to the afternoon so he could hitchhike to school. The professor refused. Langan, despite having a brain more powerful than Einstein's, didn't know how to plead his case. He got frustrated, felt the system was rigged against him, and just dropped out.
Now, contrast that tragic failure of navigation with Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer had a brilliant mind, yes, but he also possessed something far more powerful in the real world: practical intelligence.
My favorite way to think about this is a hardware versus software analogy.
Let's hear it.
Analytical intelligence, your IQ, is like your computer's hardware. Chris Langan had a supercomputer brain, the fastest processor on Earth. But practical intelligence, knowing exactly what to say to whom, knowing when to push and when to yield, reading the room, negotiating with authority figures, that's the software.
The operating system.
Right, that's the operating system. And Oppenheimer had the ultimate operating system.
The historical anecdote that best illustrates Oppenheimer's practical intelligence is almost unbelievable. When Oppenheimer was doing his graduate studies at Cambridge University, he was struggling with depression and intense pressure.
Yeah.
In a fit of despair, he took an apple, treated it with toxic chemicals, and deliberately left it on the desk of his university tutor, a man he deeply disliked.
He literally tried to poison his teacher. It's attempted murder. If Chris Langan had done that, or if any normal person had done that, they would have been immediately expelled, arrested, and thrown in prison for decades.
But Oppenheimer wasn't. When the university discovered what he had done, they prepared to expel him and press charges. But Oppenheimer used his incredible practical intelligence, his charm, his social savvy, and his parents' influence to negotiate.
Unbelievable.
He talked his way out of an attempted murder charge. He walked away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist and a requirement to see a psychiatrist.
It's insane. And he used those exact same skills years later to convince General Leslie Groves, a hardened, conservative, bureaucratic military man who was initially deeply skeptical of Oppenheimer's politics, to let him lead the Manhattan Project.
Because he knew how to talk to him.
Oppenheimer knew how to extract exactly what he needed from the world. Langan didn't. Langan couldn't even convince a math professor to let him attend an afternoon class.
Which forces us to look at where this mysterious software comes from. Practical intelligence is not genetic. You aren't born knowing how to negotiate with a general or charm a disciplinary committee.
No, definitely not.
It is a learned skill. And if we want to understand how it is learned, we have to turn to the groundbreaking sociological research of Annette Lareau.
This is genuinely one of my favorite parts of the entire discussion. Annette Lareau conducted a massive, deeply immersive study tracking third graders. She and her team essentially lived with dozens of families across different race and class lines, observing how parents interacted with some kids. And she discovered that parenting philosophies divide almost perfectly, not by race, but by socioeconomic class.
She identified two entirely distinct, culturally ingrained styles of parenting. Let's start with the poor and working class families. Lareau observed that these parents typically engage in a strategy she calls accomplishment of natural growth.
Natural growth.
Right. They deeply love their children, they provide food and shelter, but they view a child's development like a flower. You water it and grows naturally on its own. They basically leave their kids alone to structure their own free time. Crucially, they teach their children to be deferential and submissive to authority figures. You don't argue with adults. You obey.
On the other hand, wealthy and middle-class parents engage in a totally different strategy, which Lareau calls concerted cultivation.
Right. They view their child as a project to be constantly optimized. They heavily schedule their children's lives. They shuttle them from soccer practice to piano lessons to chess club.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
But the most profound difference is in language. Middle-class parents are constantly engaging their children in complex reasoning. They don't just issue commands, they explain why rules exist. They actively encourage their children to speak up, to question authority, and to advocate for their own preferences.
The interaction at the doctor's office that Lareau recorded perfectly illustrates this divide. There's a wealthy, middle-class, black child in the study named Alex Williams. He is in the car with his mom on the way to a routine doctor's appointment.
Right.
His mom turns to him and says, "Alex, you can ask the doctor any question you want. Don't be shy. You are in charge of your body." So during the exam, the doctor turns to Alex and says, playfully, "Wow, you're taller than 95% of young men when they are 10 years old."
And how does Alex react?
Alex, a 9-year-old kid sitting in his underwear on exam paper, interrupts the doctor and says smoothly, "I'm not 10.
It is a profound, incredibly telling moment. He seamlessly shifts the balance of power in the room. He corrects a highly educated adult authority figure without a second of hesitation, because he has been taught through years of concerted cultivation, a sense of entitlement. He expects his opinions to matter. He believes the doctor is his peer, not his master.
Yeah.
If you look at a child raised in the natural growth environment, like a working-class girl in the study named Katie Brindle, she would have sat quietly, eyes down, and never dared to correct the doctor.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Leroux takes great pains to note that she isn't saying concerted cultivation is morally superior. In fact, she points out that the heavily scheduled middle-class kids were often exhausted, whiny, and entirely dependent on adults to entertain them.
That's very true.
The poorer kids raised with natural growth were often much more independent, more creative with their own time, and closer to their extended families. But, and this is the massive society-defining but, in a modern corporate, academic, or bureaucratic setting, concerted cultivation is the only strategy that pays off. It is the mandatory operating system for modern success.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains the tragedy of Terman's C group, the geniuses who ended up as postal workers. They didn't lack intellect. They lacked the family background to teach them how to navigate bureaucratic systems. They lacked concerted cultivation.
It forces you to wonder, how many Chris Langans are currently failing out-of-state colleges? Not because the calculus is too hard, but because they never learned the middle-class skill of going to office hours, looking a professor in the eye, and confidently negotiating an extension on a paper.
It's staggering. It shows how being born into poverty isn't just about lacking money. It's a massive systemic disadvantage in learning the unwritten rules of society.
It really is. But, and this is why this deep dive is so fun, the narrative doesn't stop there. We now pivot to a bizarre, almost unbelievable historical moment where being a marginalized, discriminated outcast was actually the greatest stroke of luck you could possibly have.
We are talking about the incredible life of Joe Flom.
Yes, Joe Flom.
Joe Flom is the ultimate fascinating case study in how a profound disadvantage can mysteriously morph into an insurmountable advantage. Flom was the child of deeply impoverished Jewish garment workers in New York during the Great Depression.
Okay.
Despite his background, he possessed immense drive and intelligence, and he managed to get into Harvard Law School, where he became a star student on the Law Review. But when hiring season came around in the late 1940s, and Flom went down to Wall Street to interview, the elite white shoe law firms of downtown Manhattan wouldn't hire him.
And we should be clear about why. It wasn't because his grades were bad. It was blatant institutional anti-Semitism.
Exactly. Those prestigious old money firms only wanted a very specific pedigree. They wanted the tall, Nordic, Protestant, Ivy League type with the right social connections. Joe Flom was a short Jewish kid from the slums who didn't fit their aesthetic or social register. So completely shut out of the establishment, Joe Flom and a few colleagues had no choice but to start their own scrappy, no-name firm, Skadden, Arps. And this introduces his first hidden advantage: the unexpected importance of being Jewish in that specific era of corporate law.
Explain how being discriminated against became a superpower here, because those white shoe firms had a very specific, genteel idea of what practicing law meant.
The elite firms viewed corporate law essentially as dignified tax preparation and contract signing for massive corporations. They refused to engage in what they considered dirty work. Specifically, they thought corporate takeovers, hostile proxy fights, and aggressive litigation were beneath them. It was ungentlemanly.
I always explain a proxy fight like this. Imagine walking into your neighbor's house, sitting down at their dinner table, convincing their kids that you would make a much better father, and then legally kicking the original parents out onto the street.
That's a highly accurate analogy.
The polite, old money lawyers thought this was barbaric, offensive behavior. They don't want their fingerprints on it.
Exactly. So whenever a corporation wanted to launch a hostile takeover, they couldn't hire a white shoe firm. The elite firms would outsource these distasteful cases to the scrappy, marginalized Jewish firms like Skadden, Arps. For 20 years, Joe Flom just ground away in the trenches. He took every hostile takeover case he could get.
He became the expert.
He mastered the incredibly complex art of the proxy fight, basically operating in a vacuum without any competition from the major firms.
And then the 1970s hit. The global financial markets shifted dramatically. Credit became easier to get. Corporate takeovers suddenly became the primary strategy for Wall Street growth.
Right.
Overnight, hostile takeovers were no longer considered dirty work. They were the most lucrative, prestigious, high-stakes field of law in the entire world. Every major bank wanted to do them.
And who was the only lawyer in New York City with 20 years, well over 10,000 hours of specialized practice in proxy fights? Joe Flom.
Unbelievable timing.
The white shoe firms suddenly realized they needed to do this work, but they scrambled to catch up and found they lacked the expertise. It was too late. Skadden Arps rode this massive wave to become one of the largest, most powerful law firms in the world.
Imagine being Joe Flom for a second. Getting rejected by every fancy firm in town in 1948 must have felt like a crushing curse. It felt like blatant discrimination, which it absolutely was.
Yes.
But in reality, it was a protective bubble. It's like a startup being aggressively blocked from entering a crowded, low-margin market and being forced into a lonely blue ocean space that suddenly, 30 years later, explodes into a trillion-dollar industry. And that wasn't his only invisible advantage.
No, the second crucial lesson of Joe Flom is the sheer luck of his birth year, a phenomenon sociologists call the demographic trough. Flom was born in the early 1930s, right in the teeth of the Great Depression.
Right.
Because economic times were so desperate, national birth rates plummeted. So when Flom's generation grew up, they entered a world that had been physically built for the much larger generation before them.
Everything was less crowded. When they went to public schools, the classes were smaller, meaning they got more attention. When they applied to universities, it was easier to get in. And when they finally entered the workforce, there was significantly less competition for jobs.
Exactly.
The contrast here is mind-blowing. We compare a man named Mort Janklow, who was born in the trough in the 1930s and achieved immense success as a literary agent, with his own father, Maurice Janklow.
Maurice Janklow was born in 1902. He was just as smart, just as driven as his son. He went to law school, opened a practice, and bought a business. But Maurice hit his prime working years just as the Great Depression obliterated the economy. He struggled his entire life despite his talent.
Wow.
His son Mort, born in the demographic trough, hit his prime working years during the massive post-war economic boom of the 1950s and 60s. Mort succeeded wildly. Maurice struggled. The difference wasn't talent, it was timing.
Timing is everything. And Flom's third advantage came directly from his parents. They were Jewish immigrants who worked in the garment industry. Now, if you hear the phrase garment worker in a New York sweatshop, you immediately think of Dickensian misery and wage slavery.
Right.
But the reality of that specific industry for those specific immigrants was very different.
We look at the story of immigrants like Louis and Regina Borgenicht, who came to New York and noticed a gap in the market for children's aprons. They didn't just go work a mindless assembly line for a massive corporation.
No.
They bought fabric, hauled it back to their tiny apartment, and sewed aprons late into the night. It was physically exhausting drudgery, yes, but it possessed three essential qualities that define meaningful work.
Autonomy, complexity, and a direct connection between effort and reward.
Exactly. They were their own bosses, they had autonomy, they had to negotiate with suppliers, track trends, and manage finances, which provided intellectual complexity. And most importantly, there was a direct, undeniable link between how hard they worked and how much money they made.
Right. If they stayed up an extra hour to sew 10 more aprons, their family ate better the next day.
By watching their parents hustle, negotiate, and build businesses in the garment trade, children like Joe Flom internalized a profound, deeply embedded work ethic and an entrepreneurial spirit. They learned that the world, while difficult, was ultimately malleable if you worked hard enough and thought creatively.
So Flom inherited this powerful cultural legacy of meaningful work from his garment worker parents. And this brings us to a profound realization. Culture and attitudes don't just disappear, they get passed down through generations.
Yes, they do.
But it makes you wonder, exactly how long does a cultural legacy last? It makes sense that if your parents were autonomous garment workers, you absorbed that work ethic sitting at the dinner table. But what about your great-great-great-grandparents? Can the economic circumstances of your ancestors from 3 centuries ago still subconsciously dictate how you behave today?
To answer that, we had to travel deep into the Appalachian Mountains to a small, isolated town called Harlan, Kentucky. In the late 19th century, Harlan was the site of the infamous Howard Turner feuds.
Oh man, this is wild stuff.
These were unbelievably bloody, multi-generational conflicts where prominent families would shoot each other in the streets, ambush each other, and wage outright war over seemingly trivial slights or minor disagreements.
It was total Wild West, Hatfield and McCoy type stuff, just relentless, retaliatory violence.
And sociologists realized that you simply cannot understand why the Howards and Turners were massacring each other by just looking at the immediate environment of Harlan, Kentucky. You have to trace their ancestry back across the Atlantic Ocean to the harsh, lawless borderlands of Scotland and Ireland.
Okay, why?
The original settlers of Appalachia were predominantly Scotch-Irish herdsmen.
And the economics of being a herdsman are vastly different from the economics of being, say, a farmer who grows wheat or corn.
Fundamentally different. A farmer's livelihood is physically tied to the land. You can't sneak into a farmer's field in the dead of night and steal an entire acre of wheat. But a herdsman's wealth is entirely mobile. It is in his animals, his sheep or cattle.
A thief can literally steal your entire flock, your entire net worth while you sleep, and you are instantly ruined.
Because herdsmen live in this constant, terrifying threat of sudden ruin, and because they typically live in remote, mountainous areas without strong police forces, they develop what sociologists call a culture of honor.
Which means your reputation is literally your only defense mechanism. If someone insults you or steals a single sheep or challenges you at a tavern, you cannot just let it go. You can't turn the other cheek. If you show weakness, you invite thieves.
Exactly. You have to respond with overwhelming, explosive, terrifying violence. You have to build a reputation that makes it crystal clear to everyone that you are absolutely not someone to be trifled with. It's a rational survival strategy for a herdsman.
But the truly astonishing part of this research is what happens centuries later. In the 1990s, two psychologists, Dov Cohen and Richard Nisbett, wanted to see if this ancient culture of honor still existed in the modern American South, which was settled by those same Scotch-Irish descendants.
This experiment is brilliant.
They set up an incredibly clever experiment at the University of Michigan. They took young men from the American North and young men from the American South, brought them into a lab, and asked them to walk down a long, narrow hallway to drop off a questionnaire.
Right.
And they planted a guy in the hallway. They had a big, imposing Confederate working for the researchers standing at an open filing cabinet. As the student walks by, the Confederate has to squeeze out of the way, slams the filing cabinet shut, violently bumps his shoulder into the student, and loudly calls him an asshole.
It was a highly controlled, standardized insult designed to trigger a culture of honor response.
And immediately after the bump, the researchers took saliva samples from the students to measure their physiological responses, specifically cortisol, the stress hormone, and testosterone, the hormone associated with aggression.
And the difference between the two groups was night and day. The northern students, whose ancestors were mostly farmers from places like Germany or England, mostly just laughed it off. They thought the guy was a jerk, but their cortisol and testosterone levels barely moved.
Their bodies didn't care.
But the southern students, their cortisol and testosterone spiked massively. They were visibly angry. In a follow-up test where they had to shake hands, their handshakes became aggressively firm. Their bodies were literally preparing for a physical fight to the death.
And here's where we have to address your earlier pushback on genetics versus environment.
Yes.
Because I have to play devil's advocate here. These Michigan students were not 19th century goat herders struggling to survive. These kids were often the suburban, wealthy sons of upper middle management Coca-Cola executives living in air-conditioned houses in Atlanta in the 1990s. They had never owned a sheep in their lives.
Which is exactly the profound point the researchers are making. Cultural legacies are unbelievably powerful and durable. They persist virtually intact for centuries, being passed down invisibly from generation to generation through subtle cues, stories, and family reactions, even after the original economic conditions that created them, herding sheep on a rocky hillside, have completely vanished.
It's just wild.
Those suburban college kids in the 1990s were physically acting out the survival mechanisms of their distant ancestors.
If we are still acting out the economic anxieties of our great-great-great-grandparents, it really makes you pause and wonder how much of our own unique personality, our temper, our work ethic, our communication style is actually just regional history speaking through us. It's mind-blowing.
It really makes you rethink who you are.
But a culture of honor making you explosive in a college hallway is one thing. What happens when a different type of deeply ingrained cultural legacy steps into the cockpit of a commercial airliner?
This brings us to one of the most sobering and fascinating sections of our deep dive, the ethnic theory of plane crashes. We are examining the catastrophic crashes of Avianca Flight 052 in 1990 and Korean Air Flight 801 in 1997.
And we have to clarify that a typical commercial plane crash is rarely what you see in action movies. An engine doesn't just spontaneously explode out of nowhere in a clear blue sky.
Yeah.
A crash is usually a complex chain of minor errors, poor weather, exhausted pilots, a minor mechanical glitch, and, crucially, a complete failure of communication in the cockpit that prevents the pilots from fixing the minor errors before they become fatal.
Specifically, aviation psychologists point to a failure involving something called mitigated speech. Mitigated speech is a linguistic term for when we sugarcoat, downplay, or soften the meaning of what we're saying. We do it constantly in daily life to be polite, to avoid offense, or when we are speaking to a boss or an authority figure. Right. Linguists identify 6 distinct levels of mitigation, ranging from a direct command, turn 30 degrees right immediately, all the way down to a vague hint.
And relying on hints is absolutely terrible in a life or death emergency. Let's look at the Avianca crash. Avianca Flight 052 was approaching New York, but there was terrible weather, and air traffic control kept putting them in a holding pattern.
Yes.
They had been flying in circles for over an hour, and they were literally running out of fuel. The first officer, Mauricio Klotz, is communicating with New York ATC. But instead of using direct, unmitigated speech, he uses incredibly mitigated, soft language. He says things to the controllers like, "We'll try once again, we're running out of fuel." He doesn't say, "Mayday, emergency, we have 0 fuel, clear a runway now."
To American air traffic controllers who operate in a culture trained in clear, direct, transmitter-oriented communication, meaning it's the speaker's job to be perfectly understood, Klotz just sounded like a pilot who was mildly inconvenienced by the delay.
Wow.
They didn't grasp the urgency, and the plane ran out of fuel and crashed, killing 73 people.
To understand why Klotz, a highly trained professional, communicated so softly while facing imminent death, and why similar dynamics caused the Korean air crashes, we turn to the work of a Dutch psychologist named Geert Hofstede. He created a cultural measurement called the Power Distance Index, or PDI.
Right.
It measures how much a particular culture values, respects, and fears hierarchy and authority. Colombia, where Avianca is from, and South Korea historically had very high power distance indices.
In a high PDI culture, there is immense rigid deference to authority. You do not contradict your boss, you do not speak bluntly to a superior, and in a cockpit, the captain is the absolute king. The first officer and the flight engineer are subordinates whose cultural duty is to support, not challenge, the captain.
Which brings us to the chilling transcript of Korean Air 801. The plane is making a dangerous late-night landing in Guam in heavy rain. The flight engineer is looking at the instruments. He sees the weather radar, he sees they are descending too fast into a mountain, and he knows they're in desperate trouble.
But he doesn't say that.
No. Because of his high PDI cultural programming, he cannot simply yell at the captain, "Pull up, you're flying us into a mountain." Instead, he tries to communicate the danger using a highly mitigated hint. He says, "Captain, the weather radar has helped us a lot."
It is a devastating line.
I read that quote in the transcript, and I literally had to stop. The weather radar has helped us a lot. To Western, low PDI ears, that sounds like a bizarre, poorly timed compliment about the airplane's equipment. It makes 0 sense in a life or death scenario.
But you have to understand it from within a high PDI framework. In that culture, communication is receiver-oriented.
Yeah.
The listener is expected to pay close attention and decipher the subtle hint. The flight engineer was essentially saying, "Captain, please look at the radar. It shows a mountain."
Right.
He raised the issue as gently as possible to save face for his superior, allowing the captain to discover the problem himself without being overtly corrected by a subordinate. Under normal, calm circumstances in an office in Seoul, it's a beautifully subtle, highly civilized way to interact. But under the extreme stress, exhaustion, and cognitive overload of a stormy landing, the captain simply didn't possess the mental bandwidth to decipher the hint. He ignored it, and the plane crashed into Nimitz Hill.
What's fascinating here is we get very uncomfortable talking about ethnic differences like this. Modern audiences are terrified of stereotyping, of saying Colombians act this way or Koreans act that way. But acknowledging this cultural legacy of power distance isn't bigoted stereotyping. It's literally what saved Korean Air.
Exactly. For years, Korean Air had one of the worst safety records in the industry. But once they bravely acknowledged that their high PDI cultural legacy was causing fatal communication breakdowns in the cockpit, they didn't throw up their hands and say, "Well, it's just our culture."
What did they do?
They took action. They brought in outside aviation experts, and they fundamentally retrained their pilots. And the most crucial step they took was mandating that all communication in the cockpit be conducted in English.
Which acts as a massive psychological reset. English is a language that naturally encourages a lower power distance and more direct, blunt communication. It doesn't have the complex levels of hierarchical address built into its grammar like Korean does.
Exactly. By forcing the crews to speak English, they essentially gave them an alternate, temporary identity. They freed the first officers from the strict hierarchical rules of their native language, allowing them to bluntly say, "Captain, pull up."
And it worked. Korean Air turned their safety record around completely and became one of the safest airlines in the world. It proves that once we understand our invisible cultural legacies, we aren't doomed by them. We can control them.
It's a triumphant turnaround. But it does prompt us to reflect on our own environments. How often does mitigated speech cause slow-motion disasters in our own lives?
All the time. Think about hospitals where a junior nurse notices a dosage error but uses mitigated speech to hint at it, and an arrogant doctor ignores her. Or in corporate boardrooms where junior executives know a new product line is going to fail, but they are too polite to tell the CEO the truth directly.
Or even in our own personal relationships, where we let resentment build for years because we are too conflict-averse to speak our minds clearly.
It's a pervasive human issue. Now, if we accept that a cultural legacy can cause plane crashes, we have to ask the inverse question. Can a deeply ingrained cultural legacy also create geniuses? This brings us to the final major piece of the puzzle. The rice paddies of southern China, and the mystery of why Asian students so consistently and overwhelmingly dominate international math tests.
Okay, this section absolutely blew my mind. Because the explanation isn't that Asian students have structurally different brains. The advantage starts with something as basic as linguistics.
Linguistics.
Yes. If I give an English speaker a random sequence of 7 numbers to memorize, say 4853976, and ask them to recite it back 20 seconds later, they have about a 50% chance of getting it right. But a Chinese speaker will get that same sequence right almost every single time.
The reason for this lies in the architecture of human memory. The brain stores digits in a short-term memory loop that lasts roughly 2 seconds. We memorize whatever we can say or read within that 2-second window. English number words are relatively long and clumsy.
Very clumsy.
The word 7 takes about a third of a second to pronounce. 77 is a mouthful. But Chinese numbers are incredibly brief. The word for 4 is just si. The word for 7 is qi. Because the words are so short, a Chinese speaker can easily fit all 7 digits into that 2-second memory loop.
The linguistic advantage extends seamlessly into fractions, too. In English, we say 3/5. To a 5-year-old, fifth is an arbitrary-sounding term that they have to memorize.
Right, it doesn't intuitively mean anything.
But in Chinese, the literal translation of that fraction is, out of 5 parts, take 3. The language itself conceptually explains what the mathematics is doing. So from a very young age, Asian children don't experience math as an arbitrary, confusing set of rules to be rote memorized. They expect the math to make logical sense.
But the linguistic advantage is just the beginning. The true foundational driver of Asian math dominance goes far deeper than language. It goes back thousands of years to agriculture. Specifically, the grueling, meticulous work of rice farming. The researchers contrast a historical Western wheat farmer with a southern Chinese rice farmer.
A Western farm is massive, hundreds of acres. You clear the land, plant the seeds, rely on the rain, and eventually bring in the harvest.
But a rice paddy is tiny. It might be the size of a large hotel room. Yet the amount of labor required to yield a crop from that tiny plot is staggering. It is incredibly complex to manage.
It really is. A rice farmer has to engineer a sophisticated irrigation system to control the water levels perfectly. They have to nurture the seedlings in a special bed, transplant them into the mud by hand at the precise right distance, weed them constantly, and monitor the clay bottom of the paddy so the water doesn't seep out. It requires an estimated 3,000 hours of grueling labor a year.
And crucially, unlike wheat farming, where you are somewhat at the mercy of the weather and the soil, in a rice paddy there is a direct, undeniable correlation between effort and yield. The more meticulously you weed, the more carefully you fertilize, the more exact your water levels are, the more rice you get. It directly rewards exactitude and extreme persistence.
Contrast this with the historical European peasant. A European peasant worked incredibly hard during planting and harvest seasons, perhaps 200 days a year, totaling about 1,200 hours annually. But in the winter, they essentially slept. They hunkered down and waited for spring.
The cultural legacy of the rice paddy produced an entirely different worldview regarding work. There's an incredible Chinese proverb quoted in the text that perfectly captures this ethos. No one who can rise before dawn 360 days a year fails to make his family rich.
360 days a year. That is a cultural legacy of extreme, unflinching persistence. And that agricultural legacy translates directly into the modern classroom. To prove this, the researchers tell the story of a young woman named Renee. She is struggling with an educational software program, trying to figure out the undefined slope of a vertical line on a graph.
Alan Schoenfeld, the math professor who filmed Renee's attempt, makes a brilliant observation. He points out that the average Western 8th grader will look at a difficult, frustrating math problem, try a few obvious solutions for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and then just give up. They will throw their pencil down and declare, "I'm just not a math person."
But Renee sat there experimenting with different formulas, getting the wrong answer, talking it through out loud, getting incredibly frustrated, but refusing to quit. She worked on that single problem for 22 minutes.
22 minutes. That is an eternity for a teenager staring at a computer screen. Eventually, she had that aha moment. She realized, you can't divide by 0. And Schoenfeld's entire point is that being good at math isn't primarily about raw IQ or having a supercomputer brain like Chris Langan.
It's mostly about attitude. It's about having the emotional regulation and the cultural persistence to sit there for 22 minutes until it makes sense.
Which brings us to the educational researcher Erling Boe and his absolutely mind-blowing discovery regarding the TIMSS data, the international math tests we discussed earlier. Boe wasn't just looking at the math scores, he was looking at the testing process itself. Before the students even begin the math portion of the test, they are required to fill out an exhaustingly long, tedious questionnaire about their background, their parents' education, their study habits.
It's something like 120 questions. Most kids get completely bored, their eyes glaze over, and they just leave the last half of it blank so they can get to the math part.
But Boe discovered a stunning correlation. He found that if you rank countries strictly by how many of their students are willing to sit and diligently finish that entire boring questionnaire, that ranking is perfectly identical to the final ranking of the math test scores.
Let that sink in. You don't even need to give them a math test. You can predict a country's math proficiency almost entirely by measuring their cultural stamina, their willingness to sit still and persist through a difficult, boring task.
And the Math Olympics isn't a test of cognitive ability, it's a test of cultural stamina.
Exactly. And it's tragic, too, because if being good at math is mostly just an attitude of persistence born from a cultural legacy, how much massive human potential are we squandering in the West?
We routinely label 8-year-olds as not math people and put them in remedial tracks just because they give up after 2 minutes, simply because they don't have the cultural legacy of the rice paddy backing them up.
If persistence and time on task are the true keys to educational mastery, then we have to critically examine the deeply flawed, structurally biased system that Western schools use to educate children. Which brings us to our final section, Marita's bargain and the great summer vacation gap.
This completely upends everything we think we know about failing schools. Carl Alexander, a sociologist from Johns Hopkins University, conducted an incredibly rigorous study tracking 650 first graders in Baltimore's public school system.
He looked at their reading test scores in September when they started the school year, and then he tested them again in June when they finished the year. He separated the data by socioeconomic class rich kids versus poor kids.
The narrative we are always fed is that inner-city public schools are broken, that they fail to teach poor children. But Alexander's data showed the exact opposite. Between September and June, the poorest kids in Baltimore learned almost exactly as much as the wealthiest kids. The test score gains during the school year were virtually identical.
The schools, as institutions of learning, were working.
The massive divergence, the achievement gap that ruins lives, happens during the summer. Alexander tracked the scores over the summer months. While the poorest kids' reading skills actually dropped over the summer because they weren't engaged academically, the wealthy kids' reading scores shot up.
Why? Because the wealthy kids were experiencing Annette Lareau's concerted cultivation during those 3 months off. They were going to space camp, reading books with tutors, going to museums, and engaging in complex reasoning with their parents.
The devastating conclusion is that the achievement gap isn't primarily an intelligence gap. It isn't a genetic gap, and it largely isn't even a school funding gap. It is a summer vacation gap.
And the craziest part of this entire deep dive is where summer vacation actually came from. Why do we give kids 3 months off? 19th century American educational reformers explicitly based the school year on Western agriculture. They believed the human brain was literally like a field of wheat.
If a farmer plants wheat in the same field year after year without resting the soil becomes exhausted. These reformers literally believed that if you didn't let a child's brain lie fallow over the summer, you would overexhaust their minds and cause physical insanity.
It is a 19th century agrarian cultural legacy that is actively harming modern students, particularly those who lack the resources for concerted cultivation at home. But the research also points to a clear, proven solution: the KIPP Academy. a charter school network that started in the South Bronx.
They looked at the data, they took the cultural lessons of the Asian rice paddy, the value of extreme time on task, and they applied them to the inner city. They completely abandoned the Western agrarian school calendar.
KPP operates on a grueling schedule. The kids are in school from 7:25 in the morning until 5:00 in the evening. They do homework for hours after that. They go to school on Saturdays, and they attend an extra 3 weeks of school in July.
Now, the immediate reaction of a Western parent is to recoil. Doesn't that burn the kids out? That sounds like a prison sentence. But the reality on the ground at KIPP creates a fascinating paradox. Because the teachers have so much more time with the students, the atmosphere inside the school is actually significantly more relaxed.
Right. They don't have to use those rapid-fire, stressful, sink-or-swim teaching methods. The teacher isn't desperately rushing to cram a complex math lesson into a rigid 45-minute block before the bell rings.
Exactly. If a student is struggling to understand the concept of fractions, the teacher isn't forced to move on and leave that student behind. They have the luxurious time to let that student act like Renee. They can sit with them for 20 minutes, patiently working through the logic, allowing them to experiment and fail until they truly, deeply understand it. By replacing the agrarian calendar with the rice paddy ethic, KIPP entirely closes the achievement gap for its students.
We argue endlessly in this country about how to fix education. We fight about putting laptops in the classroom, or changing the curriculum, or firing teachers, or tying funding to standardized testing. But the data screens that the most effective thing we could do is just abandon the 19th century harvest calendar. Give the kids more time in the building, and they will succeed.
It all comes back, once again, to the ecology of success. You change the soil, and you change the tree.
It really does.
Okay, let's pull all of this together because we've covered massive ground today. We started this deep dive by looking for that clean X-ray of success, that glowing core of individual grit and innate talent. But what we found at every single turn was that the self-made outlier is a complete myth.
Success is never a solo endeavor.
Never. Bill Gates was undoubtedly brilliant, yes, but he also had the Lakeside Mothers Club buying a computer terminal in 1968. The Beatles had the grueling Hamburg clubs forcing them to build their stamina. Joe Flom had the protective bubble of being rejected, the demographic trough of the 1930s, and the cultural work ethic of the garment trade. Asian math whizzes have the incredible linguistic efficiency of their numbers and the relentless cultural legacy of the rice paddy. Canadian hockey players have the entirely arbitrary luck of a January 1st cutoff date.
Even Malcolm Gladwell himself, in the epilogue of the book we've been analyzing, points out that his own mother's success as a writer from Jamaica was inextricably tied to a complex, painful history of colorism, riots, and colonial legacies that happened to open up a rare scholarship for her. The self-made person is an illusion. We are all profound products of our ecology.
Which leaves us with a final, I think, very necessary thought to mull over. We've seen throughout this discussion how entirely arbitrary systems, like a January 1st cutoff date for a 9-year-old or a 19th century farming calendar dictating a modern school year, can literally make or break a human life. It dictates who gets to be a genius and who gets left behind. So look around your own life. Look at your own industry, your own company, or even the traditions in your own family. What invisible cutoff dates are operating in your world right now? Are there arbitrary rules or unchecked cultural legacies subtly filtering out the next genius before they even get a chance to log their 10,000 hours? And more importantly, now that you know how the machinery of success actually works, and you understand the specific soil that grows the tallest oak, what are you going to do to change it?
That is the question we all have to answer.
We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden logic of success. Keep questioning those self-made narratives, pay attention to the invisible ecology around you, and we'll catch you next time.